And now we're going to move into the dialogue portion of the evening, which is the question and answer. And before that, I would like to remind you to complete that all-important evaluation form, that yellow sheet of paper. And then you have pens in your bags if you need one. And the staff from the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center will be collecting the forms as you exit. So just hand the form to one of them. And I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. You make this possible because this is a dialogue between what's happening at the university and the community at large. If we can have you pass your note cards now to the center of the aisle to the staff members, and they'll come down and collect the note cards with your questions on them, and we'll begin to field the questions. So I will now turn the podium over to Dr. Dorothy Edwards, a professor in the UW-Madison School of Education and the School of Medicine and Public Health. Dr. Edwards is the director of the UW's Collaborative Center for Health Equity. She's the co-principal investigator of the National All of Us Studies, which is here on the UW-Madison site. And she's the leader of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center's outreach, retention, and education efforts. She's a very busy woman, and we're so happy to have her here with us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Edwards.
Thanks, Carol. Mostly I collect titles. They're gathering the note cards for your questions. I just want to say that I first met Dr. Henderson a long time ago, and I will tell you exactly when it was. We were at a meeting in North Carolina hosted by Dr. Peggy Dilworth Anderson, who will be our Solomon Carter Fuller speaker this spring. But Dr. Dilworth Anderson called together a group of people doing caregiving research because she was interested in the physiology, the physiological effects of long-term caregiving. She called together a group of people to put together a proposal which wasn't funded. It was way before its time. But I first heard Dr. Henderson's research and his description of how Choctaw elders defined dementia differently really made an impact on me. I can't tell you the year because I don't remember the year, but I will tell you that while he was speaking, my beloved St. Louis Cardinals gave the World Series to the Boston Red Sox. So whatever year, bad year that was when Dr. Henderson was speaking. I think it was in 1987. But so his work has had a really major impact on my work and the work of many others. And I think you can see that despite differences in race and ethnicity, in environment, whether you live in Canada, the United States, that we all share common risks and also preventive factors for dementia. So in groups that have more risk, who have accelerated rates of Alzheimer's disease, sort of accelerated aging, we can actually see the processes that benefit everyone. And so I really want to thank him for his work. So I'm waiting for the questions. I get to decide which questions our panelists answer, but I'm going to call my panelists up here also. I also want to thank Dr. Benlin, whose work on the microbiome is really, really important. I happened to be at a UW-Madison Day in Congress several years ago, and Dr. Benlin spoke to the U.S. Congress, one of the Science and Technology Committee, actually, about her work on the microbiome. So she's a rock star in the microbiome world. So, lots of questions.
Actually, Dorothy, while you sort through those questions, I just also wanted to take an opportunity to thank Carol for emceeing our event, and she's been doing this for many years, so thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start with this one. I think this goes to Dr. Gleason. Are there some personality traits that affect the likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease? Yes, actually.
How's that? Okay. Yeah, there are. There's been studies from a couple of different groups that looked at different personalities in terms of risk factor for dementia. So there were indeed links between people familiar with the big five personalities parameters. Neuroticism was one that was linked with the risk for dementia, and the term neuroticism doesn't necessarily refer to the old-fashioned term of neurotic, but it relates more to sort of a coping style of sort of anxiousness, perhaps, maybe some rigidity. But there have been, most likely, those are probably related to the behavioral outcomes of some of the personality features. But I also really like to make a sort of side comment here that we don't inadvertently blame people for getting dementia or for Alzheimer's disease dementia. The personality features or the personality variants exist in our culture for a reason. It's really important that we not then turn it back around and say to the person, you have dementia because of who you are. In fact, what I'd like to do is actually turn it the other direction and say, you have an opportunity to address this with modifiable risk factors. So if a person has factors or personality features that interfere with their ability to function in day-to-day life, if it prevents them from engaging in healthy behaviors, here's your opportunity to address that with sort of maybe it's a talk therapy or a medication that can help a person sort of get into a healthier groove. So hopefully that answered the question related to personality features, but it does indeed, there is a link there.
Thank you. So I've gotten 4 questions on gut microbiodiversity, Barb, and the effects of colonoscopy, and whether having a colonoscopy actually, because of the cleansing that has to be done before a colonoscopy, whether it actually affects your gut microbiome and are people actually at greater risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Right. So actually, the things that potentially disturb our gut microbiome, like even antibiotics or colonoscopy, it turns out that your gut microbiome bounces back. So even if we take a course of antibiotics, it changes and it decreases the amount of microbes and diversity, but it comes back almost to the same. In the case of antibiotics, not quite, but almost. And as far as I know with colonoscopy, it also, it bounces back. Yeah. So it won't be a cure.
Can you also speak to probiotics and how probiotics affect?
Yeah, so that's the other thing is if we could figure out what's missing in Alzheimer's, could we put it back with probiotics? And some people think that's something that we might be able to do. But again, when we take probiotics, it's just a very, very small drop in the bucket. So you have so many microbes there and so many different kinds. Usually when you're buying something off the shelf, it's only going to be 2 or 3 different microbes. And you take those, and then as soon as you stop taking them, they're pretty much gone. So it's hard to get them to colonize. So generally speaking, what's a little bit, maybe another idea would be to feed the ones that you have there. And then again, that gets back to we have a lot of different kinds of things there, and so we need to feed them different kinds of food. Some people also talk about prebiotics. It's things that microbes eat. Feed them to grow what you have there.
Dr. Chen, are there threshold levels of tau needed to reach a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease?
Oh, wow, that is an excellent question and a very tough one. More is known about amyloid and those thresholds, and there's just more evidence linking or showing the validity of these amyloid in the spinal fluid or in PET scans with autopsies. There's less known about the tau protein, and I think a lot of that is this technology and the science is still developing, and so the tracers that we use in these PET scans are still experimental, they're still being studied. Our center is one of the centers using them to study their validity, and so I won't be able to answer that truthfully by saying, yes, we know this cutoff and this is what it is. In essence, we're still working at that, and we're still trying to show or prove that what we see in these PET scans is what we would see in an autopsy. The autopsy, the microscope, that is the definitive diagnosis. So our pathologists are right that is the way we know for sure that a person has Alzheimer's disease. We're hoping that with the advancements in the spinal fluid and in these PET scans, not that we would replace them, but that we could use this information earlier to help people.
So then Thank you. So the next question, actually, one of Dr. Henderson's slides, really, he didn't had a chance to talk about it, was about oral disease and gum health. And so we had a good question about whether saliva samples could be taken to actually look at gum health and oral pathogenesis, and whether that might, in fact, be another early index for people who are at risk of dementia.
I need my colleagues on either side. Who wants to take that?
I'll briefly say that there have been some new studies linking potentially microbes in our mouth with brain. These studies need to be replicated. Probably the most interesting stuff is actually still in animals, where they find that if they can give a specific microbe, that it can potentially get in the brain and be something that might cause these lesions we see in Alzheimer's, like the plaques and tangles. But it's still a very, very early area, and we need more human studies.
Thank you.
Actually, just one thing to add. When we think about oral health, inflammation, and inflammation being a primary driver of what we think could be contributing to Alzheimer's disease, untreated dental issues are chronic levels of low inflammation. And so that's something that different than the actual microbe itself, but that chronic inflammation that we may be putting off because no one likes to go to the dentist, but in general, that is an important thing to address. And the other thing I'll say is that I watched a 2-minute video from Sanjay Gupta that said one of the 3 things that we can do to live longer is floss, and that's because of gingivitis and oral health.
Okay, so get your colonoscopy and floss. Actually, oral health has been linked to stroke risk. There's some really compelling data on oral health and gum inflammation and risk for stroke and TIAs. Okay, so here's another question about a risk factor, and we had several questions about this. Could one of you please comment on concussions as it relates to Alzheimer's and dementia, and are there any studies at UW being done on athletes who have had head injuries?
There are studies at UW on athletes. There's actually a large study that's being done out of Milwaukee, and UW-Madison is one of the sites, and that's in college athletes, and they're looking at impact of concussion. Obviously not in the context of Alzheimer's, because these are young people. But with regard to dementia, the picture is still mixed. So we know that traumatic brain injury is a risk factor for dementia, but we actually don't know that it's specifically linked to Alzheimer's disease. There's a very large study, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, and in that very large multi-site study, they didn't find that a history of traumatic brain injury was specifically linked with that pathology that defines Alzheimer's disease. But then you can also look at the literature. There's some other studies that suggest that it is risk factor for dementia, unknown if it's plaques and tangles specifically.
So more research needed, right? Mm-hmm. So does hearing loss contribute to dementia?
Yes. Hearing loss is one of those risk factors where, along with vision, when we think about needing those senses in order to encode information and then recall that information. And actually, there was a study that was just recently published within the past month showing that not treating your hearing or your hearing loss with hearing aids led to an increased risk for not only dementia, but depression and other mood disorders. And so that's a really critical thing that I like to talk about in my clinic, because this is one of the things that we can treat. I mean, we want people to be able to hear. And frankly, if you don't want to hear what's going on, then you just take the hearing aid out. But you have the hearing aid, so I think that's an important thing.
So these are all risk factors that we can deal with. Colonoscopies are good.
Flossing.
Hearing aids. And I don't mean to make so light of it. I think that we tend to forget that there are manageable risk factors that actually significantly reduce our risk of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And one of those is diet. So we had a whole group of questions about diet, and I'm just going to kind of, for the sake of time, try to condense them. A, any news on the MIND diet? B, what are your thoughts on a keto diet? And C, are there things that we can be doing earlier in life relative to diet and exercise that would have an impact? So
All right, so Mind Diet, some of you may have joined us for a prior lecture from Dr. Martha Claire Morris at Rush University, and she told us about her work on diet. And in looking at dietary patterns, she found that certain foods were associated with better cognitive function over time. And if you go on the internet and look up Mind Diet, Rush University will tell you specifically what those food groups are, but it's high fruits and vegetables, berries, low diets that are low in red meat, cheese, sadly. Don't eat too much cheese. But you can go online and look at those foods. And she's now testing that in a large clinical trial across the United States to see if you start this specific diet, will that be better for your cognitive function? And that's what we need these clinical trials to see. Can you change your diet and have better cognitive outcomes and reduce dementia?
any thoughts on the keto diet?
So ketone diet, that's a good question. As you'll notice, diet trends swing back and forth. And actually, keto diet is being tested for Alzheimer's dementia. Dr. Henderson mentioned that when your brain uses glucose, but as you develop Alzheimer's disease dementia, your brain actually doesn't use glucose as well. So some people have looked at alternative sources of energy, potentially ketones. However, we're still waiting on results of clinical trials, and so you might be familiar with whatever 3 or 4 years ago everybody said, take coconut oil because that's going to be good for your brain, and that we haven't heard anything about that panning out in clinical trials. But we'll wait and hear if there's some other news.
And believe me, if it comes out to be positive, Dr. Chin will do a podcast on it. I want to put in a plug for his podcast because all of these are excellent questions, and we don't have time to get to all of them, but I can guarantee you that for 90% of the questions that people have turned in, he already has a podcast available online. So I'm going to do 2 more and then do our closing because to be mindful of time. Dr. Gleason, can you tell us about different types of memory impairment? The kind of immediate forgetting, when you go into a room to get something and you can't remember what you were doing, versus other types of memory impairment that are more pathological.
Oh, yeah, sure. This is fascinating. The more I learn about the brain, sometimes the less I understand, I think. It's fascinating. There are many different types of memory, and we've learned about memory because people have volunteered for memory studies, like you all in the clinical core. That's the only way we understand memory, is because a human volunteered for this. So there are the memory, that short-term memory, or that very short-term memory, is something that you might remember over the course of a conversation or immediately after a conversation. Anything longer than 10 minutes, that's long-term memory. So think about that. So it has to become long-term memory, and it has to be consolidated, which means that the hippocampus is involved. So you guys have heard about the hippocampus. It sits kind of right behind our ears here. Think about, this is a link back to that hearing aid question. If you are reducing the amount of input through those auditory processes, pathways, it may itself cause some damage to the hippocampus and to those temporal lobes. So that's why that pathway for hearing and language is so important for memory. I mentioned consolidating memory. That's really important. That's how things get stored in long-term memory. And every time you reminisce, you take that memory back out and you re-encode it. So you're recycling that memory and you're re-encoding it, making it stronger. So how many of you have known someone with dementia or with Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia? I'm sure many in the audience. Could they tell you what happened when they were in the early stages especially? Could they tell you what happened when they were in high school or when they were younger? Oh, yeah. And they might say to you, my memory's fine. I can tell you about where I grew up. But could they tell you about what they had for breakfast? Exactly. Okay. And that is the differentiation there is between a long-term stored memory that is simply re-accessed versus a new memory that has to get consolidated and stored. And that's why we see that difference between that very short-term memory and the long-term memory. So Watch out, I can go on forever about memory, so I will stop myself. And yeah, I know, thank you.
So you wonder, those of you who are participants in our study, you wonder why we do such extensive memory testing, really trying to find those boundaries between what's normal and what's not. And we challenge people, so everyone who comes in for testing will be tested until they fail. That's just the way it's done. So I know, we've heard from our participants that they'd rather do a lumbar puncture than the memory testing. And so we know that it's hard and it doesn't feel good to not be able to answer the questions. But unfortunately, that's intentional.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll get into that in a second. So one last question. This is one that we haven't ever had before. And that's, can anyone comment on sound wave therapy for Alzheimer's disease? Sound wave therapy. I don't know that we have any.
Yeah, so there's
Ultrasound.
there's a new technology that uses ultrasound. The way that I've heard about it is to actually open up the blood-brain barrier. And if you open up this barrier, you can actually use it to deliver drugs more effectively. So I know that there's developments in that kind of technology. There's also been some work on photostimulation, which could potentially induce brain waves that could clear amyloid. So there is certainly new technologies that are being tested in the context of brain disease.
So for those of you whose questions I didn't answer, we actually take these back and we look for lectures next year, and also we give them to Dr. Chin, who has been really successful in finding people nationally. I don't mean to be so shameless, but his podcasts are recognized by our 32 sister centers as being exceptional. And we have investigators from across the network who have been willing to give him an hour or so to speak. So for those of you whose questions we weren't able to answer, I'd be willing to bet that we probably have some information online, and I'll share these questions to make sure that we cover those topics that we didn't have time to do today. The last question was, do we have enough people to do lumbar punctures? And seriously, somebody actually did ask that question. And so as the person who leads the Outreach Recruitment and Engagement Corps, I'm the person behind all of the asks, along with my colleagues, all of the investigators in the center. And as Dr. Asthana said when he was talking in the beginning, science is hard, research takes a long time, and we can't do it without you. We absolutely cannot do it without you. We could have the smartest people in the world sitting around on a panel talking to each other, and we do love to talk to each other. We really do. But without participants who partner with us to answer these questions, the work goes nowhere, absolutely nowhere. And so I want to thank each and every one of you who has participated in a study, whether it's ours or someone else's. You are driving the science forward. You are, to our good friends from Oneida who drive across the state to do lumbar punctures, I want to send a special shout out to them because our center has been distinguished by your participation. We cannot do this work without you. With these new definitions of the ATN definition that Dr. Chin so eloquently described, because I looked at those tables and it's like, what? We really need people to work with us by participating in our studies. So I cannot thank you enough for coming to hear us talk, to learning more about our work and the research, and for staying with us as you come in year after year after year. When I started this kind of research in 1980, I'm probably the oldest person in the room who's been doing Alzheimer's disease research. I was a new PhD in 1980. We didn't have we had no diagnostic criteria. Nobody actually talked about Alzheimer's disease. They talked about senile dementia of the Alzheimer's type. And we thought that there would be a cure by 1990. I was at one of the first 10 Alzheimer's centers. It was funded in 1986. We're still searching, but we have a new drug that's going to the FDA that people thought initially was unsuccessful, and then a group of other statisticians put all the data together to figure out that there actually was an effect. So this work is really important, but it goes nowhere without you. So thank you again for coming I want to thank my colleagues on the panel. I want to thank Dr. Henderson for coming to work with us. His work is incredibly important, and it informs the work that we do here, and risk and benefits for everybody. So thank you so much.